This is the first in a series of short lectures in response to the questions that were submitted in weeks 2 through 5. And this first series is going to address the neutrals, who they are, how they're appointed, if they can be removed, and some of the issues that arise mid-process with neutrals. So let's start with a mediator question. If a mediator terminates mediation, and the parties think it's premature, can they go find another mediator? The full context of this question is on the discussion board, and in that fact pattern, it's specified that if the mediator terminates because he or she thinks a party is abusing the process. If that's the fact pattern, then it's likely that one party might agree with the mediator, and it's going to be hard for that party to come around and want to continue with the mediation process. They have a termination from a mediator. They're going to probably want to go to the next step. But if the parties agree that the mediator ended the case prematurely and they think they are making progress, they just need a different person, then absolutely they can pick a new mediator. They don't have to go to the next step unless there's some sort of really rigid requirement in their contract, and I doubt there would be such a thing. I can think of a case about 20 years ago. It was a multi-party case, at least 10 parties. Because of that, it was hard to find a person who didn't have a direct conflict, and we ended up with someone from out of state, and significantly out of state. But the person came with a good reputation from attorneys who knew some of the attorneys on the current case. After meeting with just 2 or 3 of the primary parties, this person didn't even meet with any of the subcontractors, the mediator determined that this was not a case that was going to be settled, called everyone into the room, very tersely announced that, snapped his briefcase, turned around, and left. It left a very bad taste in the parties' mouths. Again, because this was so long ago and not many people had experience with mediation, it really soured the parties on it, and they did not have a good chain of contract clauses, and some of the subs ended up in litigation, some of the prime parties ended up in arbitration, and it was about a 5 or 6 year very expensive mess. I think if that happened today, first of all, I'm not sure it would happen today. Most mediators would not handle it the way this person did. But if it was ended prematurely, most of the parties probably would have come back and agreed on getting a different mediator. But just to be clear in answer to this question, if the parties agree, they can absolutely go to another mediator. The only thing that would stand in their way is a contractual requirement, and those are usually just based on timing. And if the parties are really gung-ho on mediation, then they can agree to modify or waive that time commitment. So the next question is really a little bit more about style, but it goes to the style and the selection of the mediator. So I've put it in this section, and I want to clarify what might be some confusion. There is no legal definition of facilitative or evaluative mediation that binds a party to one style or another. And it's even rare that people would put that in a contract. It's not even that common that people get down to the nitty-gritty of using those terms. What they usually do, though, is talk about the personality style. What is going to work to make this particular group of parties cooperative? And again, as I've tried to communicate through this course, in the construction industry, there is an incredibly strong network of construction lawyers who know the mediators. Many of the people who represent the parties in cases are also mediators, and they know each other's style. A good mediator is going to be able to flip back and forth between styles. Now, if the parties have come in and they've said, look, we really don't want an evaluative style, then the mediator is going to try to abide by that. But as we've seen in some of the earlier discussions, sometimes as a mediator, it's a good step for a mediator to step in and say, you know what, I think we need to try a different tactic here, and we need to get a little more aggressive. Would you mind, or would it be appropriate at this point? So getting that buy-in, asking permission, not just dropping an evaluation on parties when they're not expecting it. That would be the way to do it. And again, going back to the neutral selection process, counsel's going to talk to their party. The client's going to get some impact in deciding who should be the mediator and what sort of style they need. And the attorney's also going to know his or her client and know what they're going to respond to. Probably on the bigger cases, counsel are going to speak directly. They're probably going to agree on somebody, even if they're using a third-party provider, because again, they're experienced, they're going to know the landscape of who's out there, and then it's just going to come down to making sure that that mediator doesn't have any direct conflicts and has the time to take the case. In a matter where the parties aren't as experienced, they are going to benefit by using a third-party provider like AAA or JAMS, talking to the staff member about what sort of style, and those staff members are going to know their neutrals and know who is more appropriate for a case. And also remember that a good mediator is going to have a phone call either jointly or separately with counsel before the process starts. And there are also those pre-mediation statements. That gives the parties an opportunity to give some feedback on what sort of style is going to work and what they perceive the other side's expectations are going to be, and if they need to be more or less aggressive. But just to be clear on this question, it's absolutely okay to switch midway through the process, and you don't need to switch neutrals to do that. And finally, just talking to the mediator using caucuses. This is a good example of where caucuses are helpful, and the mediator then would go back to the other side and gently try to change the process from one to the other, particularly if the parties really are making progress and no one is threatening to leave. So now we move into one of the hybrid procedures. And if a party has found that once the arbitration stage has begun and the mediator arb on the case is not the right person, is there a way to confront this? This is tricky. Probably not. If it's a true med arb and they've gone through the mediation process and that didn't settle and now they're in the arbitration process with the same person, the parties are going to have to bite the bullet and go through to the end. The only other option really is to abort the process and start from the beginning with a new arbitrator. If they make this decision before they actually get very far into the arbitration, that may not be a problem. Maybe they haven't expended much in the arbitration. They'd be there anyway if it wasn't a hybrid. But if they've gone through a couple hearings and they're finding that they don't like this person as an arbitrator, it would only be by agreement, and it's doubtful after all that investment that they would want to change horses at this point. If they truly feel that the arbitrator is inappropriate and there's an agreement, then sure, they can abort the arbitration and start with a new arbitrator, but they would probably have to start from scratch. If it's a personality issue, I don't really know that they can address that with the arbitrator. That's usually not a recommended course of action. Without more facts as to what the issue is, it's really hard to say if there would be some other way for the parties or counsel to address this directly with the neutral. The best thing to do would be, if both parties are unhappy with this person, stop as soon as possible and start again. Certainly the arbitration selection process is one of the most critical phases, and sometimes parties short-circuit it, and that can be a problem. And this question gets to the heart of something that came up in the discussion board about professional biases. And because of the issue that is raised in this question, that is why today most single arbitrator cases in the construction industry are heard by construction lawyers. It's just the way it's fallen out. Even if a lawyer has a higher percentage of his or her clientele that represent owners or represent GCs or subs, parties tend to have more confidence that because that person has sat on both sides of the table, because they have presented cases or defended cases against one side, they're going to have to know the other side pretty well. And that person, that lawyer arbitrator, is also going to have an appreciation for the process because they're going to want their clients to believe in it. So they're going to be a little more conscientious about putting aside that professional bias, and sometimes you'll see that lawyer arbitrators' biographies are a little bit better about detailing their background and showing that they have a broader experience. There's certainly some who only represent one construction profession, but even those folks are usually more universally accepted than someone who is a general contractor, an architect, or an engineer. I will also just point out there are very, very few owners who are arbitrators, and that is a complaint. Because when you get to having a 3-member panel, the point of a 3-member panel is a balanced panel. I am a very strong advocate of not having 3 attorneys or 3 GCs or 3 subs as the arbitrator. It's a waste of money, really, to have 3 professions. The point of having a 3-member panel is to have 3 different professions asking the parties questions and listening to and analyzing the evidence and arguments. That is a tremendous benefit of arbitration. And on the larger value cases, the $2 million and above, a 3-member panel is usually worth the investment. Very sophisticated parties might raise that ceiling. And it is a waste of money if it's a much smaller case, although I have seen $100,000, $250,000 cases with 3-member panels because the parties really disagree about whether it's a contract issue or a design issue or a construction issue. But parties absolutely discuss the concern about professional biases, and this comes to using a third-party service where you're going to get a list, and the parties are going to use a ranking and striking process. And that way, at least they have a little bit of input and they can express their preferences. They may not get their first choice, but at least they'll probably have an ability to strike a certain number of names. Go back and read those provisions in the AAA and JAMS rules about how the neutrals are usually selected, and you'll see that there's a little more party control that helps address this issue of professional bias. And the final question takes us back to the Mead-Arb process. And just to clarify again, if there's going to be a separate neutral, then it's really not the hybrid process. It's more the standard of what you see in most construction contracts, that you select one person to be the mediator. If the mediation does not settle, then the parties select a completely separate person or panel of 3 people to be the arbitrator. And this is more often the case. The hybrid procedures really aren't used that often in construction. It can be great if it works. I only know of a handful of cases, and I can only think of one that was in construction. In the hundreds of cases I've seen it be a little more successful in the employment and the just more general business contract cases. And where the parties seem to have the most satisfaction with it was the flip, where it's an arbitration. That person hears the evidence and the arguments, then renders a decision but doesn't give it to the parties. That decision is sealed, and a very specific process for what happens to that award is established in writing before the process starts. Then that same neutral becomes the mediator. And that's where the sharing of information is a little bit better. He or she has heard the arguments and heard the evidence. Now he or she is trying to get the parties to settle. If they settle, based on whatever they agreed to before, that award is probably going to be given to a third party and certified that it's been destroyed and the parties never see it. And they make their settlement into their final resolution of the dispute. So the Arb-Mead process probably should be looked at a little more than it is, but everyone's more familiar with the term Mead-Arb. But just to close this section out, Mead-Arb is not used very often, unfortunately, because most of these things are done privately. That's the downside of private dispute resolution. There are very few statistics out there on how often it's used. So what I'm giving you is anecdotally. But again, think about the Arb-Mead process. Sometimes that might not be bad for the mid-size case. And we'll stop here and then pick it up with more of the process questions in a minute.